David, are we ready? Yep. Good evening, everyone. I'd like to begin with the land acknowledgement. The West Hollywood Planning Commission acknowledges that the land on which we gather, and that is currently known as the City of West Hollywood, is the occupied, unceded, seized territory of the Gabrielino Tonga and Gabrielino Quiche peoples. The time is 6:34, and I would like to call this meeting to order. And we can move to item 2, which is the Pledge of Allegiance. Vice Chair Gregoire, would you kindly lead us in the pledge? Thank you. Thank you. That brings us to item 3, roll call.
Thank you. Good evening, Commissioners. Commissioner Solomon. Here. Commissioner Matos.
Present.
Commissioner Jones.
Here.
Commissioner Huppengarner.
Present.
Commissioner Carvalero.
Here.
Vice Chair Gregoire.
Here.
Chair Lombardi.
Present.
And we have a full quorum.
Great, thank you. Item number 4, we'll now move to approval of the agenda. And first, I will ask if staff has any changes. This is for, this is approval of the agenda. So does anyone have a motion and a second? And if you could please use the touch screen, that would be great. Motion by Matos. Would anyone like to second? Okay, seconded by Chair Commissioner Huppengarner. Okay, well, we'll register it as you.
And the agenda is approved unanimously.
Thank you.
For September 19th, 2024.
Thank you. Item number 5, approval of the minutes. These are the minutes from September 5th, 2024.
I'll move.
And
I
does
have
staff
a
have any?
correction.
Yeah. Does staff have any changes?
Staff does have one correction. On page 7 of 11, we want to strike out the first sentence, and we just want to replace it to make it more clearer. So we're just replacing it with it was indicated meaningful construction as written in section 4.1.5 needs further clarification, and then striking out that entire sentence before.
That's
Okay.
in the third paragraph.
Yes, thank you. On third paragraph.
Which is on the screen right now. Commissioner Jones, I know you made a motion. It sounds like there may be further comments, or is...
No, that was my correction.
Okay, great. Do we have a second? Okay. Commissioner Carvalero, thank you.
And the motion carries unanimously, approving the minutes as amended for September 5th, 2024.
Thank you. Item number 6 is public comment. Do we have any public speakers at this time, in person or on Zoom?
We have no public speakers that have signed up here in council chambers, and we have no one on Zoom. I do have, I did forward you 3 comments that came in for general public comment. Those are available online, and I received one after the deadline, so I would like to read that into the record. Congregation Kolemi is hosting a West Hollywood City Council Candidate Forum on Sunday, September 22nd, 2024, from 3 to 5 p.m. in person at 1200 North La Brea Avenue, West Hollywood. The doors will open at 2:30 p.m. Patrick Auerbach will moderate the forum, which will focus on local and state issues. Register early, as seating is limited and preference is given to West Hollywood residents. Kolemi has been an active part of West Hollywood community for more than 30 years. And they hope to promote civic engagement and voter turnout through the candidate forum. At the time of this writing, the following candidates have confirmed their attendance. Alphabetically, Larry Block, Jordan Cockerman, John M. Erickson, Danny Hang, Dorian J. Jackson, George Nickel, William West Siegmuller, and Jakaya Z. Wright. The organizers have invited all candidates who will appear on the official ballot to speak at the forum and have endorsed the candidate. The moderator is a sitting consulate and seasoned executive leader who served for more than 23 years at the University of Southern California, and including 11 years as the Associate Senior Vice President for Alumni Relations. Congregation Kalami was founded in 1992 and is West Hollywood's Reform Synagogue. It is rooted in the LGBTQ plus experience and Jewish tradition with a strong commitment to social justice, Israel, and diversity. Kolami and Rabbi Lindy Resnick offer a vibrant array of programs, learning opportunities, social gatherings, and social justice. For more information, visit www.kol-ami.org or call 323-606-0996. And that was submitted by Wendy Goldman of West Hollywood. And that's all we have.
Thank you. That brings us to item 8, consent calendar. There are no items. And then item 9, public hearings, section 1, projects subject to the housing
Director's
accountability.
report.
Chair.
Oh, sorry, director's report. Item 7, I've already got it checked off here.
Good evening, Chair, Vice Chair, and West Hollywood Planning Commission and community members. I have a brief report for you tonight. Nick Marisich, Director of Community Development. First, I wanted to share that at their meeting this past Monday, the City Council received and filed the latest quarterly update that we provided on major development projects in the city. This includes information on 19 projects spread across the city, including 8 of which were previously approved and 11 that are still in the planning process. The full report can be accessed through the council agenda for the September 16th meeting, and it's item E4. And then I wanted to announce that the city will be hosting a Mobility Expo on October 5th. The Mobility Expo, which was developed by staff based upon direction from the City Council, is intended to increase awareness of the multimodal transportation resources that are available to the community. The event is free. It will be held on the Great Lawn at Plummer Park, again Saturday, October 5th, between 10 and 2 p.m. Community members are invited to explore and engage with various mobility vendors, including free to low-cost transit services such as the City Line, the WeHo Pickup, LA Metro, and available transportation services for older adults and people with disabilities. Vendors will also share emerging transportation technology, such as autonomous vehicles and electric vehicle options, and the event will include a community bike ride and demos on bicycle safety. There will be light refreshments and other giveaways for the public while supplies last. This is also part of Move LA's SoCal Transit Week. And for additional information or questions, you can reach out to the Long Range Planning Division at planning@weho.org. This concludes my report for tonight. Just want to acknowledge that we thank you for your service. We know you're all volunteers and put in a lot of time in this role and service, so thank you for your service, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, appreciate it. Are there any questions from the commission for our Community Development Director? No? Okay, thank you. And now we can move to item 8, consent calendar. No items today. And then item 9, public hearing subject to the Housing Accountability Act, also no items. And that brings us to our first hearing of the evening. This is item 10A, public hearings other than items that require public hearing under the law per the Housing Accountability Act. First item is 10A, General Plan Amendment, Local Hazard Mitigation Plan. This is a public hearing to consider adopting a resolution recommending the City Council adopt a general plan amendment replacing Appendix A with the updated 2024 local hazard mitigation plan in the safety and noise element of the West Hollywood General Plan 2035 citywide. And I believe now we'll have a staff report.
Thank you, Chair Lombardi, and good evening, Commissioners. Tonight, you will be reviewing the resolution to amend the general plan to incorporate the city's updated local hazard mitigation plan. The presentation will be provided to you by Anthea Rosenbaum, our intern in long-range planning, her first time presenting to the Planning Commission. So with that, I will hand it over to her. Thank you.
Good evening, Chair, Vice Chair, and Planning Commission. As Francisco said, my name is Anthea Rosenbaum, and I am an intern with Long Range Planning. With me today is Francisco Contreras, Nick Marisic, Tahira Ferris, the City Attorney, Danny Rivas, Anita Shandy, and Margarita Kustanovich. I'll be presenting on a general plan amendment to incorporate the 2024 Local Hazard Mitigation Plan, and it should take no longer than 5 minutes. In this presentation, I will go over the background of this general plan amendment, an overview of the proposed general plan amendment, and the staff recommendation. In this section, I will cover the mitigation planning is, how it works, what the process looks like in the city of West Hollywood. Before we get into what local hazard mitigation plans are and how they are created and approved, I'd like to clarify that the general plan amendment is an administrative action. This plan was approved by City Council in November of 2023. Before the plan could be incorporated into the general plan amendment, the plan needed to be approved by FEMA. FEMA approval occurred in July 2024. Now that the local hazard mitigation plan has FEMA approval, the city is formalizing the plan by proceeding with this general plan amendment. Because City Council has already approved the plan, the content of the plan is not changing. Rather, we are doing this administrative task of updating our general plan to include this already approved document. So with that, hazard mitigation planning is a collaborative process in which risks, hazards, and vulnerabilities are identified and assessed. These plans are intended to serve as guides for communities to reduce adverse impacts. In addition, local hazard mitigation planning enables access to FEMA funding programs, increases education and awareness, builds partnerships across the WeHo community, and identifies long-term strategies for risk reduction. There are 2 agencies who are at the center of the hazard mitigation process, and that is FEMA and Cal OES. FEMA is the Federal Emergency Management Agency, which is tasked with helping people during, before, and after disasters. Cal OES is the California Office of Emergency Services, which is the state's hub during all major emergencies and disasters. There are several federal and state requirements that inform the hazard mitigation planning process. The first is the Disaster Mitigation Act of 2000, which identifies local hazard mitigation plans as a condition for receiving hazard mitigation grant program funding. To remain eligible for this funding, these plans must be updated every 5 years. In addition, California code requires general plans to have a safety element, which must be updated every 8 years. In April of 2023, FEMA published Local Mitigation Planning Policy Guide, which is the official guide for local hazard mitigation plan requirements. West Hollywood's original hazard mitigation plan was published in 2004 and has received 3 updates since then. As the previous plan was set to expire in November of 2023, the city retained Jacob Green and Associates in February of 2023 to help with the local hazard mitigation plan update. After retaining Jacob Green and Associates, the local hazard mitigation planning process began in April of 2023 and was completed in November of 2023 with the approval of the plan by City Council. During this time, in September of 2023, the city submitted the local hazard mitigation plan to Cal OES and FEMA for review. As local hazard mitigation planning is a collaborative process, there are multiple opportunities for engagement. This came in the form of surveys, in-person meetings, and public comment periods. There are two processes for FEMA and Cali OS approval. The city took the route which is highlighted in the box. So this means that WeHo staff submitted the local hazard mitigation plan to Cal OES and FEMA before city approval. So this occurred, submitting to Cal OES and FEMA on September 29th of 2023. Then City Council approved the plan in November of 2023. After conducting its review and determining that the plan met all of its requirements, on July 11th, 2024, FEMA issued approval pending adoption. The city then submitted proof of the plan's adoption, and upon receiving that proof on July 15th, FEMA issued final approval. Now, West Hollywood's local hazard mitigation plan is set to expire on July 15th of 2029. I will now go over the proposed general plan amendment. The updated local hazard mitigation plan includes the identification, description, and graphics of new hazards, the identification of projects that might be eligible for future funding, changes to mitigation strategies, and some administrative changes. The general plan amendment would revise Appendix A in the safety and noise element with the updated local hazard mitigation plan as it was approved by FEMA and City Council. To reiterate, there are no changes to the City Council's approved plan. With that, I will present the staff's recommendation. The staff recommends that the Planning Commission adopt a resolution recommending that the City Council approve a resolution amending the safety and noise element of the general plan to include the updated 2024 local hazard mitigation plan. Given that the local hazard mitigation plan was approved by City Council in November of 2023 and by FEMA in July of 2024, the city is proceeding with this administrative task of formalizing the plan by proceeding with this general plan amendment. Thank you very much for your time and consideration. I am available for questions.
Great, thank you. And before we get too far, I just want to check, are there any disclosures? No? Okay. We can jump into any quick clarification items for staff, but thank you for a lovely presentation, and I think you made it pretty clear, but I just want to reiterate, this is primarily an administrative or housekeeping item today, so this has already been approved by City Council, it's already been approved by FEMA. What we're being asked to do as a commission today is to formally recommend adoption of this by City Council, actually. So it's just our recommendation to them to make that change in our zone text. So that's why we're hearing this today. So our framework is fairly limited. So I don't have any questions, but of course, if there's questions we can ask, or we could go to public comment if there's any. Would anyone like to ask questions of staff at this time? Okay, let's go to public comment.
Thank you, Chair. We do have one public speaker here in chambers, Kevin Burton. You all have 3 minutes. Please state your name and city of residence.
Kevin Burton, resident of West Hollywood, and I am the co-founder of a local West Hollywood-based group of Community Emergency Response Team volunteers that is CERT. We're referred to as WeHo Recert. And I spoke in November when Council considered this item, and thanks staff for all their hard work in putting it together. They received a lot of comments from the community for identifying a variety of hazards in West Hollywood and suggest making proposals how to mitigate and prepare to address those hazards. And Council was very supportive as well. I was a little surprised to see this coming back to you tonight, but the explanation is that bureaucracy moves on and that you don't have to do any extra work. But I just wanted to reaffirm my support for this plan, and also to say that there's a long list. I don't know if you've looked at it, it's just administrative, perhaps you didn't read through it, but there's a long list of proposals that the steps the city can take to better prepare itself for emergencies. And with this plan, the city becomes eligible for funding. And I very much hope the city will move forward applying for funding and taking steps to better prepare. If you're interested in emergency preparedness information that applies to West Hollywood, please do visit our website at WehoResearch.org. It's Weho, RECERT.org. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. And Chair, that is our last public speaker.
Okay, thank you. Are there any questions from the commission at this time? And if not, any discussion, or would anyone like to make a motion? Motion by Commissioner Matos. Great. Anyone like to make a second? I don't see any. Okay.
Clearly, we have technical difficulties.
Yeah, there's definitely a lag here, unfortunately.
There is a correction.
You have a correction you'd like to make?
It's minor administrative, but the title's wrong.
The title is wrong on which document? The resolution?
The resolution. It's minor, but since we're doing it.
Well, we have a motion in a second, but maybe that clarification can be made, so I'm going to ask Commissioner Matos.
I thought I did make a motion, but it's showing as Commissioner Hoopengarner as the motion maker. So.
It's interesting. Yeah, I don't know what's happening either. This is clearly not working today, so perhaps we won't use it. But that being said, it sounds like there's a clarification item. Did you want to maybe pick that up?
Yes.
Okay, great.
Is there a staff recommended change for the title?
Yeah, so, and I think because of the technical difficulties, so just to articulate on the record, so we have a first from Commissioner Matos and the second from
Cavallero.
Carvalero, and then a discussion item from, a clarification from Commissioner Hoopengarner to correct the resolution number. The resolution which says amending with an extra M. Is that the correct articulation of the?
Yeah, except for, again, my system said I was the motion maker for whatever it's worth, so I think we got some system issues.
Right, I think in light of that, maybe it makes sense to articulate the first and second just by voice vote, just to keep the record straightforward.
So, motion, anyone? Matos?
Yeah.
Okay, motion by Commissioner Matos, second?
Yes.
Second by Commissioner Carvalero. And your motion is with the minor correction on the
Correct.
subject line?
That the staff read into
Okay.
the record. Perfect.
And I'll just ask Commissioner Hoopengarner, are you good, or did you have any other further questions?
No, that was it.
Okay, thank you. Let's see if the voting works, because it's definitely delayed on my side.
Commissioner Solomon? Thank you. And the motion passes unanimously. There is no appeal process. This is a recommendation going forward to City Council, and it is approved as amended PC Resolution 24-1567.
Thank you. Now we probably need a minute to switch gears here. While that is happening, the next item, item 10B, is a zone text amendment. This is for demolition permits for problematic vacant buildings. This is another public hearing, and this is regarding that said zone text amendment to enable the issuance of demolition permits for vacant properties that pose public safety risks citywide in the city of West Hollywood. Is staff ready, or do you need a few more minutes? Ready? Great.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. For tonight's presentation, Tahira Ferris, Senior Planner with the city, will be providing the presentation. So, and I think we're trying to put the right presentation on the board for you, so a minute.
Thank you, Francisco. Good evening, Chair, Vice Chair, and Commissioners. My name is Tahira Ferris, Senior Planner with the Long Range Planning Division. And tonight I'll be presenting the zone text amendment for demolition permits for vacant properties that pose an imminent threat to public safety. So I'll go over the background of this proposed zone text amendment, and then I'll go through the actual proposal itself and the recommendation for you tonight. So to start with the background here, we'll start with a definition of vacant property. Vacant property is defined in Chapter 9.64 of the West Hollywood Municipal Code as a property that is substantially vacant, unoccupied, or abandoned for more than 45 days, and where construction pursuant to an active building permit is not taking place, or where an inspection by the Building and Safety Division pursuant to an active building permit has not been conducted within the previous 90 days. We do have a vacant property registration program within the city. That program began in 2019, and this provides a system for tracking and addressing vacant properties within the city. Vacant properties are put into 4 categories labeled as stable, at-risk, problematic, or failed. So a stable applies to properties that are well maintained. They require a few, if any, repairs and can be easily reopened or reoccupied. At-risk properties applies to those that are fairly well maintained but have repairs that are needed. For example, they may have peeling paint or dead vegetation, graffiti on site, or broken fences. These properties are at risk, but they show that the owners are responsive to the city's requests. And then we have problematic properties that refer to those that are not maintained by the owners. The structures are determined to be, are not necessarily determined to be unsafe, but they do require significant repairs, and there may be evidence of intrusion into the properties. And then finally, we have failed properties, which refers to those that are completely unmaintained and do pose a significant risk to the broader community. The structures may be unsafe to enter or occupy, and there may be evidence of intrusion into the property. So tonight we are actually proposing a mechanism outside of this registration program, and this is to deal with properties that may fall into the failed category, but also may be outside of this system and go beyond the identified issues within these 4 different categories and require an outside process. So this would be a rare occasion to utilize this new process that we are bringing before you. Currently, there are 53 vacant properties within the city, and over the past year or past months, there has been a growing number of complaints that the West Hollywood Sheriff Station has received, as well as the city's code enforcement, about issues of vacant properties where folks are intruding into these properties and creating problems for the surrounding community and for the individuals themselves. It is also unlikely that these types of properties are going to be repaired by the owners or reoccupied, but they do still pose these imminent public safety threats to the individuals and to the surrounding community again. So this is what we are attempting to address. So in March of this year, the City Council directed staff to work with the city attorney and create a process to authorize the demolition of vacant properties that do pose these risks to public safety in both commercial and residential zones. And then again, in August, the City Council directed staff to actually expedite the process for a zone text amendment according to the following timeline, where staff would bring the zone text amendment before your commission tonight, and then back to City Council in October. And so we are bypassing the regular process of going to the Long Range Planning Project Subcommittee at the direction of City Council. The zone text amendment that we're proposing would have a 2-year sunset date, so this would allow us time to assess the impacts of this new procedure that we've created and determine if we do actually want to make the process permanent at that point in time, or determine if there's anything to amend by that process, or if perhaps we don't need it any longer. So now I'll go over the proposed zone text amendment. So first, starting with the current requirements in Chapter 19.50, which includes provisions for demolition permits. Section 19.50.020 states that the discretionary approval of a demolition permit is required before any demolition of a building or structure or before a substantial remodel. And that's required before any structure is moved from any site within the city. And then additionally, the code requires concurrent processing of demolition permits with any other required discretionary permits, with just 2 exceptions. So right now, the first exception allows for the issuance of demo permits prior to other discretionary permits when there is an imminent hazard posed by the building, as determined by the building official. This right now is a high standard to meet. It refers to the structural deficiencies of the building itself, not necessarily hazards that may be caused by folks intruding into the property and creating unsafe scenarios. So what we're proposing is another alternative. This is a local policy that ensures that properties don't sit vacant for too long, that land is utilized for its best purposes as quickly as possible when things are vacant. And so that's why all of these exceptions do currently exist. We are not changing anything about the 2 exceptions that do exist, but we are creating a new one. And I don't know if I mentioned, but the second exception that currently exists is when Planning Commission approves an interim use for that satisfies a public need for a site that's vacant. So the proposed zone text amendment would make changes to section 19.50.020, which is the applicability section for demolition permits. And what we're doing here is reflecting the exceptions in which a discretionary approval would actually not be required for a demolition permit. So this amendment would apply to residential and commercial properties, whether or not they have existing entitlements. We are adding 2 new subsections, so A1 and A2. A1 is actually the existing exception that I mentioned, where the building official determines a vacant property to be an imminent hazard. We're actually changing language there. Instead of saying imminent hazard, we'll say deemed unsafe. And that's to be more in line with the actual building code and language that's used in the California Building Code. The other section that we are creating here, A2, is the new exception for when a property is deemed an imminent public threat, and that would be determined by the community safety director in consultation with the community development director. And again, we've specified a 2-year sunset date, so this would allow the city to kind of assess the impacts of that program and this policy change. The new exception would also have criteria to help determine what would constitute an imminent public safety threat. And those are listed on the screen. They would include calls for service to the West Hollywood Sheriff's Station or code enforcement due to trespassing on a property, a report of fire related to trespassing, or the property owner failing to comply with on-site security requirements, and the property being unsafe due to public health or safety risks. Also, if the property owner is just completely unresponsive to the concerns, or the owner may be unknown, and the property is not being maintained in compliance with the city's policies and has been cited more than 2 times in a 6-month period for fire-related hazards. We're also proposing to change section 19.50.040. This is the concurrent processing section that I was speaking about previously. So previously, the exception where the building official can determine a vacant property to be unsafe was listed in this section, but in reality, the way that that is normally processed is that exception would be exempt from the concurrent processing, so we wanted to make that clear and move that up to the applicability section. So with this new policy, demolition permits may also be issued for adjacent structures on the vacant property if they are determined to be contributing to the public safety hazards or concerns. And this will address concerns raised by the public as directed by City Council to address an imminent threat to public safety. By creating this new avenue to address these imminent threats, code enforcement can follow various procedures, including existing abasement abatement procedures that are pursuant to Chapter 1.32, which is abatement of nuisances within the West Hollywood Municipal Code, as the Community Development Director and in consultation with Community Safety Director deemed necessary. And then there are additional tools which are listed on this slide to give you an idea of what may be considered. In addition, to ensure compliance with both our local code and also state law for housing protections, if the property contains any housing units, a deed restriction will actually be placed on the property requiring replacement of those units prior to demolition, so that at the time a new project is proposed, that housing would have to be replaced on the site. And additionally, if there was any affordable housing, then that would need to be replaced at the income levels that were existing on site. Similarly, for historic resources, if a property does contain a historic resource or a potential historic resource or one that is being formally considered for designation, a demo permit would not be approved prior to discretionary review for that. So that would be an exception to using this scenario. And then also, if there is any vegetation on site that may need to be removed as it is deemed to be contributing to the public safety threat, the Community Safety Director in consultation with Community Development Director would have the authority to authorize that removal of vegetation as deemed necessary for public safety, so to the extent that that would be necessary. So just some considerations. These regulations are included in the zone text amendment to address the growing concern and public safety risks that have been brought before the city and city council. The goal is to avoid properties from becoming vacant for extended periods of time and discourage property owners from neglecting their properties. And this exception would only be used on rare occasions as a last resort when the city is not obtaining compliance from property owners and all other remedies have been exhausted. So with that, I will share the staff's recommendation, which is to adopt a resolution recommending to the City Council approval of an ordinance adopting an amendment to Title 19 to authorize the issuance of demolition permits for vacant properties that pose public safety risks. And that concludes my presentation, and we'll be welcome any questions.
Thank you. Before we get to questions, are there any disclosures? Anyone? No? I mean, I will say that I've had discussions with community members about this item and even some of the properties that are listed in some of the staff report. So I just wanted to note that. But if there's no other disclosures at this time, we can ask clarification questions from staff, or we can go to public comment. Does anyone want to ask some simple questions up front? Commissioner Matos.
Thank you, Chair. Thanks to staff, Community Development Department, Community Safety Department for bringing this forward. Quick question. How did we land on a 2-year sunset for the zone text amendment versus, for example, like a 4-year sunset? Like, what was the impetus behind using that?
I think 2 years, I think, kind of seemed kind of like the right sweet spot, so that if we did implement something that maybe had some unintended consequences, that we might be able to capture that a little bit sooner rather than later. It just gives us a short time frame in order to make those evaluations and then report back to the city council. At the 2-year time frame, we may come back to the city council and say, if this is working out, let's make this permanent. So, 2 years just seemed appropriate time.
So the idea would be that this would be a pilot zone text amendment and then determine at a later date if a longer time is necessary for this to be in the code?
Correct. We would pilot it and then, make the evaluation in 2 years. If at that time we think that it would be better to make it permanent, then we would make it permanent at that time. Or
Okay.
make that recommendation to the city council. Correct.
Okay, thank you. No further questions. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Any other questions from my colleagues? Commissioner Hoopengarner?
This may be a question for Mr. Rivas. In looking at the March staff report to City Council and looking at the list of properties that this applies to, I noticed that there are 16 problematic properties, no, it says 14, and 0 failed. One, does this code only apply to failed properties, or will it also apply to problematic properties?
So the intention was that this would apply to any property based on the new criteria that was developed. So they may fall into any one of those categories, or problematic, failed, at risk, but it's really for a different avenue outside of that.
But, so then we would have 2 sets of standards. One is this at-risk, problematic, failed metric and categorization, and then a separate whole process that doesn't reflect these categorizations?
Yeah, so the existing vacant property program has the 4 different categories as a way of maintaining those properties, and so our community safety team might speak to that a little bit, but this proposed ZTA is intended to be outside of that process. So while the properties may fall within one of those categories, it's really to capture those that have other public safety risks that are really due to intrusion on the property or things like that that are causing these public safety hazards.
So help me, the language here says it includes an imminent public safety threat. But the problematic definition is the structures are not determined to be unsafe.
Right, so the vacant property maintenance program, that definition with the problematic, you mentioned the structures. So this new process that we're creating doesn't mean that something's wrong with the structure itself. It actually just means that the property is lending to intrusion where there may be fires have taken place on the property because of that intrusion. So it's creating other public safety risks that may not be due to the actual building.
But the problematic definition is very specific, that says there is evidence of an intrusion.
Right, again, this is outside of that existing procedure.
Okay. The property on Sierra Bonita, was that listed as failed? The one that burned?
We'll invite our community safety director to speak.
I guess
to
I'm
that.
trying to understand when this would be implemented and how, because that's a specific example of something that one would think had failed because it burned down.
Yeah, thank you, Commissioner. Danny Rivas, Director of Community Safety for the City of West Hollywood. So the classification at the time was not at a failed classification. And then to answer your question originally, so the 4 classifications that are currently established in a separate chapter, that is relating to the vacant property registration program. So that allows us, the city, to be able to see what category we're able to bill a property owner for based on the elements there. So as Tahira had mentioned, is that what we're trying to do here is create a separate path that allows staff more flexibility when we are coming up across issues that staff is identifying or that are being reported to us, so that then we can act quicker, but it is a separate process from that.
So are you proposing to maintain a different list with a different set of categories and a different set of checks?
No. So we would maintain our current vacant property registration program and all of the requirements that are in Chapter 960 and 964. And so that process in terms of compliance, how we're applying billing and so forth, that is going to remain as is and in place. This is simply giving staff the ability to address properties where they don't have an entitlement. Let's say in some cases maybe a property owner is on board and willing to demolish because they are having trespassing issues. And so all of those calls for service, the resources, et cetera, that are being exhausted, including the community and neighborhood concerns, would allow us then the ability to order the demolition of a property, whereas right now, we're incapable of doing that because unless they have an entitlement and the other things that they meet currently in the code, we're prevented in terms of doing that and just following the regular process that we have in place now.
I appreciate that. I guess I'm trying to understand the steps, the mechanics of how this would work. So I see in A.2, you know, they've had 2 calls for service and you have all of these things. Will you be maintaining a list that says, yes, there's been 2 calls for service, and yes, there's been a warning, and yes, there's been, you know, what has happened? Because, for example, a call for service doesn't necessarily mean a citation has been issued, because many times the officer will just issue a warning and say, be good, and there is no actual citation. So how is that going to be tracked?
I get you, understood. So yeah, absolutely. Code enforcement staff will be keeping track. Each of the cases is assigned to an officer, and then you have a supervisor, and of course the manager, and staff actually review that on a monthly basis internally, and then even as part of the vacant property task force, which is made up of other divisions and departments within the city and our public safety partners. And so absolutely, that is definitely something that we're going to be keeping track of and having a metric.
And there would be a master list that the council could review, et cetera?
So we don't publish that out because these are code enforcement investigations. That's not something that we put out. So you'll see in the staff report that there are not specific addresses. That is intentional because a lot of these cases may end up before the city council for a nuisance abatement hearing and other action. And so we want to keep that process completely separate.
But just like this list is generic, you could keep a generic list, correct?
Correct. Well, internally, ours would be very detailed and specific, but yeah, if we were to put something out and provide an update in terms of our vacant property updates, which we do once a year to the city council, then it would be generic and it would be reflected in that.
Okay. So related to that, can we get back to the mechanics of how this would be implemented? Because you've already differentiated between a cooperative owner and an uncooperative owner. And, you know, how would you characterize that, and how would you track that, and how would you enforce one differently than you enforce the other?
We wouldn't. We would remain consistent in terms of the criteria, and I believe that we reflected that in the staff report, right, that would show some or all of the characteristics of the types of issues that we would be considering. But in terms of what we make a determination on property owner being cooperative or non-cooperative, that's basically in response to the written action that we're taking. So if we're issuing somebody an order, if we're issuing somebody a citation, if we're reaching out and trying to communicate with those folks and they're just being completely either unresponsive or basically are not following through on anything that we're asking them to do, so that is categorized as being non-compliant, and then we would proceed with our next step in the process. And that is something that staff does in every single code enforcement case.
Okay, so moving on, and maybe this is partly a question for legal. So would this involve a condemnation process? I mean, you would be condemning the property in order to demo it. Yes? No?
Commissioner Hoopengardner, I'm not sure if it involves a condemnation process outside of sort of the parameters of the text amendment itself. So I'd probably have to think about that.
Because I would think that that would have an impact if you're proposing to demolish someone's property that they own. Wouldn't you have to condemn it?
And isn't cooperative.
What?
Correct. Sorry, I didn't mean to interject.
No, go ahead.
You're asking about if there was an uncooperative owner.
Well, in either case, I mean, you're talking about red tagging presumably a building and condemning it. I mean, is this part of a condemnation process? Because it's my understanding there is a process around condemnation. Yes.
Yeah, I can't speak to that specific. I would turn it over to our code folks.
Sure, yeah, and thank you. Now that I have a little bit of clarity on that. So no, what this third approach and pathway would not require that process. That would be something that already exists. We are changing a little bit of the language that we're suggesting to make in terms of the unsafe that's determined by the building official. So that would be essentially, right, ordering based on the determination that a building and the structural integrity, right, has reached a level that would make that determination. But this is a separate path. So no, if we took the public safety impact portion of it, that would be a different path.
So you could demolish a building that is not in fact red tagged?
Correct. We would
Okay.
be ordering the property owner to do so. Yeah.
Okay. So in that process, earlier I asked about who would pay for it, and you said if need be, the city would pay for the demo and the remediation if you have an uncooperative owner, and that the city would then place a lien on the property to recover the fees and the costs?
That is correct.
Okay. Is there any mechanism, and maybe this is again a question for legal, to incorporate the cost of carry on those costs?
I'm sorry, say that again. Include the cost of what?
The cost of carry, the money costs. In other words, if the city tomorrow, enforces this action and spends $100,000, doing the asbestos remediation and the lead remediation and all of the testing, and then demolishing, and then let's say somebody has to put up a fence, somebody has to protect it, somebody has to pay for the ongoing protection of the lot if we have an uncooperative owner. So if all of those costs are then rolled into a lien against the property so that when the property is sold, the city could get back their money. I'm looking at a scenario where, that is in receivership, it's in bankruptcy, it goes on for years. Is there any device, any mechanism that allows the city to get interest on the costs that they have spent 5 years ago, and, we've all lost use of that money and interest on that money. And now imagine this happens for 10 properties, and that's $100,000, that's $1 million that we no longer have use of. Is there any mechanism to incorporate the interest costs quarterly, annually into that lien?
No, I'm unaware of any agency that has pursued a receivership or placed a lien as a result of a code enforcement action being capable of applying any sort of interest. The recovery costs are based on actual cost and staff time. So everything that you mentioned, if we ended up hiring a contractor to perform asbestos removal, the testing, if we ended up having to hire security on site leading up to that, all of those costs, in addition to the staff time and the staff hours, legal costs, administrative citation costs, all of that is bundled together, and then we're capable of placing a lien on the property. In addition to that, we would pursue more than likely a receivership, and that would be a little quicker. So if the property did end up trying to file for a bankruptcy and so forth, we would be able to recover our costs from that avenue, in many cases a lot quicker than placing a lien on a property. So there are different mechanisms and tools for us to pursue, and that's definitely something that we consult with our city prosecutor's office in weighing out what's the best and most efficient and effective option for us to pursue.
Okay. Let's just quickly go through your A2 items that are your checklist here. Item B says that the LA County Fire has determined that the cause of the fire on the property is related to trespassing and not arson. What if no determination can be made?
In that regard,
Mm-hmm.
so yeah, if we have a situation, right, where somebody ended up getting on the property, they caused the fire, and so if there is arson involved, then that is something that the fire department relays to the sheriff's department, and you actually have detectives that will investigate that and make those findings. If it's not that type of situation, based off of what our fire personnel are seeing when they're on site, and the investigators are taking a look at that, and so that's how we would be making that determination.
So in the absence of a positive arson assertion, the assumption is trespassing, because in my opinion there's possibly a third option, which is a lightning strike, a electrical fire, so there could be a fire that has nothing to do with trespassing or arson. So in that scenario, what happens?
Yeah, so that's a great point, and that's the type of input and feedback that we're looking for from the commission as well, right, as a part of this item. And so when we take this before the city council, we can actually take a look at that and see if there's any sort of changes and adjustments that we need to make. So.
Okay, and that's why I'm walking through the mechanics of it, you know, step by step. In this scenario, what happens? In this scenario, what happens? We talked about if code gives a warning, and I guess that's one of my questions here, will there be some sort of mechanism within the department that says, okay, we've got a problematic property, et cetera, they're maybe still only at risk, but we've got something else going on. Will officers still be allowed, and I'll put that in air quotes, to give verbal warnings as opposed to if they're called out and there is a situation having to give a citation?
Absolutely, yeah. They'll continue that practice. They do it now. There's that.
They don't give any warnings? They just always give a citation?
No. I said they do that now in terms of what you mentioned, that they do give verbal, they do make contact. The goal is voluntary compliance. That is the goal of the program. And so if somebody's being cooperative, somebody's responding, then giving a verbal, and they're able to take that photographic evidence or whatever it is when they're doing the re-inspections to show that a property's been brought into compliance, then that's the goal. So they will continue to provide that service. They do not just go from 0 to 100 in terms of issuing a citation, but it all depends on the circumstances.
So if there's a situation where there's warning, 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 at what point does that turn into no, it's time to cite?
Yeah. Typically, it occurs if it's the same exact type of violation that is occurring within a 1-year period. Then at that point, a code enforcement officer will pick up where they left off, right? If they gave somebody a verbal, then at that point, it will go into a more assertive and more formal type of warning. But all of that is documented. And so again, it's up to the code enforcement officer. In many instances too, they confer with their supervisor and their manager on how best to proceed with the situation.
Okay, let's move on to item D. The building or structure on a property is unsafe to enter or occupy due to significant public health and or safety risks. So this kind of ties back to our ABCs of failed versus problematic, et cetera, but also who deems that?
So that would be a combination of the code enforcement officer that's handling the case. In many instances, they will also work with our building and safety personnel as well. And so there'll be a joint inspection. Even in some instances, they'll extend that to the health department. And so you'll have a health inspector as well that'll come out and assist in that. So
code enforcement is empowered to deem a property unsafe and a structure unsafe.
From a structural perspective, that is where we look to our building and safety partners. But from a property maintenance, health and safety code related, if there's other instances like we've described, then that is something that the authority of a code enforcement does possess.
All right, item F. The property is not being maintained in compliance with the city's vacant property and or public nuisance ordinance, has been cited more than 2 times within a 6-month period for fire-related hazards. Is it only fire-related hazards, or are there any other hazards that would apply? There seems to me there might be other hazards than just fire.
Yeah, we're really focused more on the fire-related hazards as it relates to this, because then that ties it back into the public safety impacts, the trespassing, the intrusion, and other activities that may be occurring on the property that are not only being reported to us, but are being confirmed by our public safety partners. And so we are concentrating on that. That is our proposal.
So drug use, et cetera, is not a public safety hazard, it's just the fire.
it could be something that we take into consideration. So, as we mentioned, some or all of the aspects here are considered
Okay.
globally
Thank
as we
you.
instruct them.
All right, I'm trying to be efficient here. Okay, let's jump on to subsection E. To ensure that if a vacant property, building, or structure is deemed an imminent threat in public safety, any vegetation or trees can be removed with, I think it's Director of Code Enforcement, et cetera. Question number one, why are we conflating vegetation and trees into one category?
I don't know. I think the language there is probably consistent with what's reflected in the zoning ordinance already.
I guess, I mean, to me, there's a very large difference between mowing down very high grass and weeds, et cetera, and ripping down all the trees. So they're two very different standards, and these are being all put together into one. And so that's why I'm trying to understand why you would treat trees and vegetation the same way.
Yeah, understood. What I can tell you is that in terms of the consideration that we would be consulting with the Community Development Department on is really associated with trees and larger types of vegetations, right, that in many instances have not been irrigated for a while, they're not being cared for, they may be diseased or dead and whatnot, and so those are the types of instances and situations that we'd be considering.
Precisely, thank you. And that brings me to my next question, which is we have relatively new ordinances around tree removal with requirements to use certified arborists, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm wondering why that process isn't incorporated in here, because rather than having no offense to code enforcement's many skills, but I don't know that any of them are certified arborists and can determine whether a tree is disease, damaged, or a hazard. And why wouldn't we require a certified arborist to make that determination?
Yeah, in many instances, you are obviously going to be looking at the totality of the situation on a specific property. You know, the specific location of maybe where a tree is located and its adjacency to a neighboring property and the calls. And so that may be something that is taken into consideration, obviously, and having an arborist come out and make an assessment. So those are all things that can definitely be considered.
Well, I guess not just considered, but it is part of our code before a tree can be removed. So I guess I'm wondering, does this code intend to supersede the code on the canopy tree and the tree requirements? I mean, maybe legal can answer which. We now have two codes that say the code enforcement person can authorize a tree removal, and then we have another code that says, no, all tree removal has to be done by a certified arborist.
So I think one item is that I want to flag is just looking at 1926. I know part of the applicability of that separate chapter talks about tree removal in conjunction with new development or a major remodel. I think the intent here was to limit and to include language that limits the removal of trees or vegetations, in this instance specific to the imminent hazard associated with the proposed demolition. So in that sense, that's why there are sort of procedures in place to include the Director of Community Safety and the CDD Director to ensure it's limited just to trees and vegetations that are part of the issue that is going to result in the demolition, separate and apart from a major remodel or new development or where there's other entitlements.
I'm just envisioning scenarios where, you know, oh, this is a hazard, and a bulldozer comes in and everything gets ripped out and no one really looks at the existing tree canopy and the existing trees. And so that's why I'm asking these questions. I think they're material, especially for some of these properties, which brings me to my next question, which is back to, now we have a vacant lot. And back to the mechanics of the different scenarios. And we have a vacant lot, which has no fence, which has no protections, which is, in the case of an uncooperative owner, is the city now going to be putting up fences? If so, what kind of fences are required? For example, chain link fences, easy to climb. Is there some sort of requirement for a not easy to climb fence? Have these considerations been incorporated in this code?
Those were considered, but there's already a process and our practice in regards to vacant lots. The city can install fencing and do all that as a part of any sort of abatement process if they feel the need. You know, we wouldn't go for any sort of fencing material to try to prevent folks from jumping over. It has certainly been our experience that people will find a way to get into a property if they really want to. Although I can tell you in the time that I've been here in West Hollywood and even in other cities, we have zero issues as it relates to vacant lots, as opposed to having a structure that's there now that folks are wanting to get into the property to gain shelter and do other things, right? So those types of situations are really non-existent in terms of them being problematic, aside from maybe having some weed abatement that's required from time to time on a vacant lot. But we can certainly perform that maintenance. We can certainly place up a fencing, and it would be a more non-obscuring type of fence. For our public safety partners, it's always best, especially when you're getting calls in the late evening hours, to be able to see exactly what's on the other side of that fence. So,
Of course.
yeah.
And in fact, that's why I was asking about the kind of fence, because they would need to be able to quickly visually. Okay. So related to that, and now question is probably back to Tahira and friends, which is, as part of this process, was there any discussion around, okay, the city has now paid for all of this demo and we've paid for fences, et cetera. Is there any thought to, now we have a situation where we have a lot that's presumably going to be empty for any number of years, especially if it's under receivership, and this is maybe illegal, you know, are we talking eminent domain, but, you know, can this become community gardens or, you know, so was there any discussion around future uses of the vacant lots?
So just to step in, I think on the question about eminent domain or those proceedings, I think that would be certainly case by case specific or contained sort of within separate and apart from the zoning title, you know, within the code enforcement chapters on nuisance. And I know, I'll turn it over to the long range folks. I know the sort of discussions of future uses relative to an interim use is something where the demolition could result in a discretionary decision that comes back to the decision makers on something like a community garden. I don't want to overstep for long range, but.
Yeah, there already is a process through which an interim use could be proposed on a vacant site. The Planning Commission would approve that, so it would be a discretionary process that would come to the Commission.
Once the property was already vacant?
The interim use would be after the demolition, so okay. Correct. Okay. It would come through. And I think, you know, when we're talking about the amendment to this process and why it lives sort of in Title 19, I think it's because the city has that unique situation where the Planning Commission does approve the demolition permits discretionarily, concurrent with the other entitlement application. So this process allows a new avenue by which the demolition permit could occur based on these health and safety impacts, but the ability for an interim use or a different change of use on the vacant property would come back to Planning Commission, similar to other projects where you might have a similar change of use.
Okay, thank you. That's my questions.
Any other questions for staff? I have let me just check here. So I feel like this may be a silly question, but I'm going to say that there are none, so I'm just going to ask anyway. I just want to make sure that I'm understanding the exact intent with all of this. So the idea here is that this could really apply to any property, right? Not just a property that is potentially under redevelopment or would have all of those typical permits that would go along with demolition and redevelopment. It could be any property that becomes a safety risk.
That's correct,
Okay.
under the council's
Okay.
direction.
And then there's a lot of language about determination by the director or by the city. So in certain instances, that would be determined at that level, and in other instances, it would be determined at via a planning commission hearing, correct? Or would it always go to planning commission?
So this new process that's being proposed is going to be determined at the director's level, so it would be the community safety director in consultation with community development director. But in the instance where we were talking about a proposed interim use, that is something that would come before the planning commission.
Okay, and I think that that's where it's also relating to section, this is page 9 of 10 in the resolution, section 19.50.040 of our code, concurrent processing of permits. So that's the scenario where it gets presented to the planning commission, and that's item C that's being revised, correct?
Correct.
Okay, just want to make sure that I am understanding all that. Which brings me to a potentially related question, and I'll apologize in advance. You may not have answers to this, but first I'll ask definition of at risk, if I'm understanding correctly. That's relating specifically to cooperation on the ownership's part, and that is in some ways separate from what we're looking at here or what these mechanisms would allow. But at risk would be an owner that's responsive to city requests, right?
Correct.
Okay, thank you. And then just looking through the property list, the 1300 Fairfax block was designated as problematic. I think that was the March City Council staff report. Is that current? Do you know, is that currently listed as problematic, or has it changed categories?
I don't know per se. I would say it might move into something that was sort of a separate discussion, separate and apart from the CTA, if that makes sense, in terms of the specific property.
I'm asking because I'm trying to understand a scenario where there's a development agreement and what that means for us. So is that pertinent to the discussion today? Relevant?
Yeah. Apologies, Chair. I just meant trying to move us away from maybe a specific property site discussion.
I have questions about this because I think it's a good example. So I'll leave it at that then. If there were a property that were labeled as problematic, I guess I'm wondering if it has since changed status. And if I'm understanding correctly, these are really not the framework that would be determining the demolition permits anyway, although it could be a factor, but it's not really related. I'm still curious how this comes to be, because some projects will come to us, and so that context I think is helpful. But
Chair, and just to follow up on that, sorry to interject, I think the difference might be for a project that already has entitlements. This wouldn't be the process that would be in use. So a project potentially that has a DA and conditions of approval associated with entitlements might have its own set of standards that might vary from the need to utilize this process in the rare instances where it applies.
Okay. However, some of those properties may be on this list as well.
Correct.
I still feel like because it's in the documents we're reviewing today, I'm curious if the status has changed on a few properties. But
and that property does say it's in plan check.
Yes, exactly.
I believe the list is current.
Okay, thank you. So it has not changed since March. That's the only other question that I have at this time. But thank you for clarifying a little bit more about the process and how it would come to us. Are there any other questions from my colleagues, or should we go to public comment? Public comment. Secretary Gillig, are there any public speakers?
Thank you, Chair. No, we have no public comments on this item.
Okay, great. Then we can move into discussion unless there's any other questions.
Chair, could I make one brief announcement? I think just because of the issues we had with the first and second and the technicalities, it might be efficient for these second two zone text amendments to take that by voice vote, and then David can, or Mr. Gilly can manually enter that.
Agreed. My system is not doing much of anything right now, so that's appreciated. I'm just looking toward the left right now, so any questions this way? Commissioner Matos?
I'd like to speak.
Or
Thank
sorry,
you.
yeah, deliberation.
Yeah, we're in
Okay.
deliberation now, not earlier. Thank you so much, Chair. I just want to make a quick comment. I want to thank the Community Development Department and the Community Safety Department, Director Rivas and his team, Director Marisic and their team for working collaboratively on this. As we all know, this is a very serious issue in our city. We've seen nuisance properties create significant hazards to abutting residences, both on Sierra Bonita and Fountain and in other areas of the city. I think this is an important tool in the tool belt. Serving on the Business License Commission, I got to see a lot of the work of our code enforcement and how they work with our public safety department on the back end. I do have faith in this process and the process that's been laid out because it has been done and it is currently being done throughout our city. It is a very routine process being applied to a different scenario to prevent any type of public safety risk. So I think that this is absolutely necessary. I would love to move this item when it is appropriate. Thank you very much, Chair. That is all of my comments.
Thank you. Commissioner Jones?
Sure. I just want to thank staff and also Danny Rivas, I think, did a great job in my purview, in my mind, of kind of just giving a really thorough explanation of the questions asked, and I appreciate that. So I'm inclined to support this as per staff's recommendation, but I'm open to discussion. Those are my comments. Thank you.
Great. Please.
Thank you to staff for putting this together so quickly, too. This was at council not too long ago, so I appreciate the expedited process and the work that went into it. Great presentation tonight. I will also support this item. The one thing is that I wish we could charge interest. I don't know if there's a mechanism to do that. It sounds like from what I heard from Director Rivas, we can't, but I'm glad that we do have a tool to keep our neighborhood safe. Thanks.
Thank you. Any other? Vice Chair?
I don't need to add anything additional other than say I support staff's recommendation.
Okay. Commissioner Hoopengartner?
Yeah, I mean, I'm really torn on this one because I really do believe we need some tools and mechanisms to ensure safety of our communities. I mean, obviously what happened on Sierra Bonita is significant. My concern is sort of more, if you will, top level, in that what we're doing is creating a mechanism to allow developers to essentially allow their properties to go to rack and ruin and just say, okay, whatever, just knock it down and not have to go through the proper development process that you would have in terms of a development permit that they would have to get in the as part of doing the process. So we've already got a situation where we have any number of properties that in fact have already been improved and entitled and have been allowed to deteriorate dramatically. And I think those of us who've been on this commission for any period of time know that regularly we get projects brought to us to say, oh, whoa, the owner has let this property go to rack and ruin, so guess what? We want to get this better, so therefore we have to approve the property because they've already let it go to rack and ruin. And I just am concerned about, further setting that process up. I also don't, I think there's some mechanical issues around this code that could be possibly adjusted, but I really have concerns about incentivizing developers to just de facto let the properties deteriorate.
Commissioner Matos?
Thank you for those comments. I actually don't see this as any type of incentive for properties to deteriorate. I see this as a disincentive, something that is in the city tool belt to actually address properties that have been neglected. And I might add, just having been a resident of the city for many years and actually looking and seeing the cases that we've seen of parcels that would be applicable to this, these are not always properties that have been issued or are waiting for development permit or any type of planning processes. There's been many buildings and single-family residences and other instances where a property is in holding and there is no development suited for it, or where the property is going through some sort of will or final estate of someone who has passed, or the property has been, acquired and then abandoned for numerous reasons. I even recall one where there was some sort of foreign purchaser of a property and then they abandoned it. So I don't see this having anything to do directly with development per se. I think that most of the times we see good actor development coming into our community. I think that this is actually a disincentive, saying that if you acquire a property and then you let it to go to neglect, then there will be consequences for it, even in instances where there is no planning process, there is no approved plans, and the property is just merely abandoned. So I think that this is an important tool in the tool belt, and I think it's been well thought out by staff. Thank you. And I'll move approval when the time is correct.
Commissioner Carvalero, did you have anything to add?
Yeah, I think the staff report was very well written. I think it's very thought through. Thank you, staff, for putting all that time into it. I agree with Commissioner Matos. I don't think that this is an incentive. I think this is a disincentive for developers because it just lays out exactly what's going to happen if they let their property deteriorate. And my experience with the city, and this is not saying anything disparaging about the city, but nothing happens immediately. A tree's not going to come down the next day. The building is not going to come down the next day. And there's a process in place. So I don't think that this is causing, it might cause issues, but as far as I read the staff report and our discussion tonight, I don't see the issue with moving this forward, and I'll be happy to second it.
Thank you. I'll add my thoughts. So I'm looking at this in terms of the context that there is a sunset clause as well. So there is some opportunity here. We find that there's issues that can be evaluated or potentially pivoted. I think some of the larger concerns that I had, they appear to be addressed. For example, a scenario where maybe a building of design merit or historic relevance is then bypassed through that sort of process. That would be one concern that I have. I'm also thinking about the fact that there's different scenarios that this applies under, and sometimes it may be properties that are in the process of maybe redevelopment or development, and other properties that are not. And I agree. I think just from my experience on projects that I have worked on over the years, I would think that this would be a disincentive for developers. I don't think that having this sort of foil in a plan necessarily moves things along any faster. It creates more variables, and variables can have impact on anything right down to the funding that you get on a project. So I don't think it's really in developers' interest. I think that also in those scenarios, in theory, we would be vetting these things as well and helping to make those determinations. And I think that the real question or concern that's been brought up by community members and got us to where we are today is the risks with certain properties on site. And so I think that in general that this makes sense to me. I understand there may be some concerns with the text. I don't see specific things that would need to be modified in concept at this time, and I would be prepared to move forward. But obviously, if there's concerns, I'd love to hear them. At this point, everyone has spoken, so I don't know if there's any follow-up discussion or if someone wants to make a motion. Commissioner Hoopengarner, did you have something you wanted to add?
Yeah, I mean, certainly the sunset clause is a great step in terms of, because we don't always get things right the first time around. So it's an opportunity for us to test something out and see if it works well. I do have a great deal of lack of comfort around the tree removal. And I have a concern, because I forgot a disclosure. A neighbor did bring up the vacant lot situation to me, that the vacant lots aren't being maintained that we currently have. And in fact, on the list that we received from the city council staff report, there were a number of vacant lots on the list, and they're not being maintained. They're full of poop bags and, a lot of weeds, and that is a detriment to the community as a whole, both in terms of health and safety, as well as, speaking as a gardener, having a weed farm next to my property is not ideal. And as in terms of quality of life and community, that is problematic. And we already have a lot of those properties, and they're not being enforced and they're not being maintained. So I'm concerned that we're talking about just making more of those. And yes, we do have structural problems and we do have potential fire hazards, but I'm just concerned about this process truly being done correctly. And at this point, I can support it, but I really wish that certain things were corrected. Thank you.
Okay, is there any further discussion, or would someone like to make a motion?
I'd like to make a motion.
Okay, what is your motion?
To move the staff recommendation.
Okay, so we have a motion by Commissioner Matos and a second by our Vice Chair. Is there any further discussion at this time, or should we move to vote? I think we're going to vote.
And we're going to be doing a voice vote.
Okay, roll call vote.
Thank you. Commissioner Solomon? Yes. Commissioner Matos?
Aye.
Commissioner Jones?
Yes.
Commissioner Hoopengarner?
Yes.
Commissioner Carvalero?
Yes.
Vice Chair Gregoire?
Yes.
Chair Lombardi?
Yes.
And the motion passes unanimously, approving resolution number 24-1568. There is no appeal process. This is a recommendation going forward to the City Council.
Thank you, Secretary Gillig. Are we all good with time? Does anyone want a break? We'll push through? Okay. And does staff need a moment to get set up? Yeah.
No.
And our next item is item 10C. This is the firearms ordinance, distance limitation between firearm and alcohol sales. This is a public hearing to consider a zone text amendment to prohibit any establishment selling firearms to be located within 1,000 feet of establishments selling alcohol within or outside the city of West Hollywood. And is staff ready? I know we have one commissioner that stepped out. Maybe we just take a quick 30-second break.
Isaac, your very first staff report. Ooh.
I'm in a different seat, Chair Hoopengarner. Hope you can still recognize me over here. Yeah. Chair, I'll just give it a minute too. And
okay.
Yep.
I'll just ask now while we're waiting, are there any disclosures from anyone? No? Okay.
All right, good evening, Commissioners. So tonight before you is a public hearing to consider a zone text amendment that would prohibit the sale of firearms in West Hollywood within 1,000 feet of alcohol establishments. And I'll run you through a very brief staff report. So the background on this, in June of 2023, the City Council directed the City Attorney to evaluate ways to further City's commitment to reduce gun violence and provide the health and safety of City residents. Some of that will be occurring outside the zoning ordinance. But the item this evening amends an existing gun regulation that lives in the zoning code. So there are statistics cited within your agenda materials that were published and posted. That includes CDD data over a 4-year term from 2015 to 2019 that really looks at the impacts of gun violence in the United States. CDD data from those 4 years equals 316 individuals that are shot daily, with 106 people dying as a result every day. Also within the city's staff report is data that comes from Los Angeles County that evidences the impacts of gun violence locally. So as I mentioned, the city does actually have an existing gun regulation on the books consistent with the Second Amendment. That's West Hollywood Municipal Code Section 1936-134 that currently forbids the sale of firearms within a firearms business that sells guns or ammo within 1,000 feet of any other establishment where firearms are for sale. And that restriction exists within or outside city limits. So although we certainly can't control the permitting of gun shops outside the city, the restriction applies within city limits. So if there's a gun shop in a neighboring jurisdiction, there would still be a limit under our code that would preclude the city from allowing one within 1,000 feet of any other establishment. So tonight's zone text amendment proposes to amend that section, expand the existing 1,000-foot limit, and also apply it to establishments that offer alcoholic beverage sales for on-site or off-site consumption, which includes liquor stores, restaurants, and nightclubs. And just to note, we do have a definition within our municipal code for alcoholic beverage sales. It's the retail sale of beer, wine, and/or other alcoholic beverages for on and off-site premises consumption. So really briefly, the legal authority underpinning the zone text amendment before you tonight starts with the broad constitutional police power under the California Constitution. That section underpins all of the city's zone text amendments. It's the police power, it's the authority to craft land use regulations and enforce within the city's limits all local police, sanitary, and other ordinances and regulations that are not in conflict with general laws. And courts have repeatedly held that the city's police power authorizes it to adopt reasonable land use regulations. There's also a study cited within the agenda materials that find a correlation between heavy drinking and gun homicides and suicides. And that information provides a basis to conclude that limiting firearm and/or ammunition establishments in proximity to establishments that sell alcohol could help the city reduce incidents of gun violence. And then really briefly, the Second Amendment of the federal Constitution, just as a primer, it was a 2008 decision by the Supreme Court that recognized the individual right to bear arms. That's a Heller decision. Since that time, and in a more recent 2022 Supreme Court decision, the court set out a new standard to evaluate Second Amendment challenges or land use regulations or other regulations that deal with the right to bear arms. The new standard is whether the Second Amendment covers the conduct at issue. That's a text-based review based on the actual text of the Second Amendment. And then 2, whether the government can justify its regulation by showing consistency with historical tradition of firearm regulation. So there's been a couple pertinent Ninth Circuit decisions, both before and after that Supreme Court standard came into effect. In short, the Ninth Circuit, which controls over California, has found that, well, the Second Amendment does include some right to purchase firearms and ammunition. That right is not violated absent quote, meaningful constraints on access. And there is actually case law that says expressly that there's no right to have a gun store in a particular location so long as individuals have some meaningful opportunity to purchase firearms. And here the city is confident that is the case with existing gun shops throughout the region and in neighboring jurisdictions. So the proposed zone text amendment itself is fairly straightforward. It's on your screen. The amendment to 1936-134 would include that existing prohibition on establishments that offer firearm sales, which is also a defined term in the code. And so that's the existing restriction, and then it adds a new subdivision B that also makes that prohibition, or that proximity limitation rather, applicable to establishments that offer alcoholic beverage sales. Similarly, that's either within or outside the city. And so the recommendation this evening is the city adopt a resolution recommending the City Council approve the ordinance amending Title 19 and find that action exempt from CEQA, and I'm available for questions.
Thank you. Are there any questions for our city attorney or city staff at this time? Commissioner Hubengarner?
I was joking. Only 12 questions.
Is that what you said? I couldn't quite hear you. Okay, well, ask your 12 questions.
It was a joke.
So no questions? None. I thought maybe you had one question. Okay, no one has any questions. Okay, Commissioner Jones.
I do have a quick question, just a point of clarification so that I'm clear. I understand that there's no way for us to regulate essentially what's happening outside of the city. And I'm assuming, perhaps incorrectly, that that's why we wouldn't just make it illegal for there to not be, it's not permissible for anyone to be able to sell guns within 1,000 feet of the city, of like the city border, correct? So it needs to be from a certain point or a kind of establishment that is selling a certain kind of item?
Correct that we can't regulate sort of outside our city jurisdictional lines. We can, however, control that proximity limit within city lines. So 1,000 feet is applicable even if the gun shop is located in a neighboring jurisdiction.
Okay, understood. Okay, those are my questions. Thanks.
Any other questions?
Why 1,000 feet? Why could we make it 1.9 square miles from a place that sells alcohol?
I believe in part because 1,000 feet was the existing standard for firearm establishment to firearm establishment in our existing code limitation. And I imagine in part the restriction is based on ensuring under the Second Amendment there still is that right to, for individuals, the right to bear arms, to purchase firearms in the region.
Okay, any other questions? Secretary Gillig, do we have any public comments?
Thank you. We have no public comments for this item.
Okay, no public comments in Zoom or in person. Shall we move to deliberation?
I'd like to move the item.
Okay, a lot of people jumping, but it sounded like Vice Chair Gregoire motioned and Commissioner Matos seconded. So we have a motion and a second. I know, Chair Hubengarner, you also spoke. Sorry, Commissioner Hubengarner. So vote. We're going to do a roll call vote unless anyone has any questions before we move to vote.
Thank you. Commissioner Solomon.
Yes.
Commissioner Matos.
Yes.
Commissioner Jones.
Yes.
Commissioner Hubengarner.
Yes.
Commissioner Carvalero.
Yes.
Vice Chair Gregoire.
Yes.
Chair Lombardi.
Yes.
And the motion passes unanimously, approving resolution number 24-1571 as presented. This is no appeal process. It is going to City Council on recommendation.
Thank you. Next item, item 11, new business. No, we have none. Item 12, unfinished business, also have none. Item 13, excluded consent calendar, and we have none. That brings us to item 14A and 14B, items from staff, the planning manager's update.
No items from staff. And I don't know if you would like me to proceed to the calendar?
Yes, that would be great.
Fantastic. So we did want to mention that the October 3rd Planning Commission meeting is canceled, so don't come on October 3rd. Start preparing your costumes for Halloween. But October 17th, we do have several items on the agenda. So one of the items is an extension request for 645 Robertson or Robertson Lane. So that will be on the docket. We also have a zone text amendment that's going to be considering ministerial housing permit. So that's a new permit to expedite the permitting of particular housing projects. In addition, there is a subdivision of a 5-unit residential building at 1123 North Formosa Avenue. So that's coming up for the next Planning Commission meeting. For the Long Range Planning Project Subcommittee meeting for October 17th, we are going to be reviewing a ZTA for commercial to residential conversions, so adaptive reuse projects. For Design Review Subcommittee, there are a couple of items coming up here September 26th. So there is a review of 8020 Santa Monica Boulevard. That's proposed renovations to an existing service station, as well as 845 San Vicente Boulevard, which is a 10-unit building on the corner of San Vicente and Hilldale. And then lastly, for the Sunset Arts and Advertising Subcommittee, there are a couple of items for the October 10th meeting date, and that will be a review of billboard at 8760 Sunset Boulevard. That's that circular building on Sunset right across from the city's billboard. And then there's also a review of the billboard at the Den, which is 8222 Sunset Boulevard. So that concludes items from Planning Manager. Thank you.
Thank you. Are there any questions for our Planning Manager, or does anyone want to note any potential conflicts or absentees for upcoming meetings? No? Okay. Any questions for our Planning Manager? Okay, thank you. Item 15, public comment. Secretary Gillig, do we have any public comment speakers?
No public comment.
Okay. Then that moves us to item number 16, items from commissioners. Any commissioners have anything they would like to speak on today? No? Okay. Well, then in that case, quick note, as just stated, reminder that the Thursday, October 13th Planning Commission meeting is canceled for due to a public holiday. October 3rd, public holiday. So the next regularly scheduled meeting will be Thursday, October 17th, 6:30 p.m. here at Council Chambers. Thank you.